Thank you so much. I'm hoping that I'm audible and everybody can see the slides well.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you for that intro. So in this title, you'll note a relation between liberation, the word that those pushing for independence from colonialism prefer to decolonization, and deliberation. This relation isn't etymological, but in this talk, I'm trying to connect them. And this is because we weigh up, we remember, we dismember, and we reclaim as we think about what we're doing, where we're going, with who, what, why, and what will be left or lost. This conference is a commemoration of sorts, and with it comes the bittersweet recognition of the incommensurability of what was imagined. What was imagined was radical, perhaps beautiful, fundamentally different, and the failures and gains of those plural visions in our practice. I framed this title with a sense of that deliberation of commemoration about what was made fragile, the good and the goods of the university, and of knowledges in particular. I'm using the words we here, and I'd like to say it's not because I'm trying to suggest that there's homogeneity with all who are listening, or to assume that we're all going to be of like mind, but rather we as part of a community of educators within university systems. I've never worked at Wits or in Gauteng, and although I grew up in a town at Joburg's outskirts, my social and intellectual formation was formed more within academic and artistic communities in the Eastern Cape, where I'm also affiliated, as you heard, and in the past decades with academics and learned societies in India, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, through where I'm based now in Belfast. I'm hoping that you'll see the use of this word we as a recognition of my own implicatedness as an academic, previously within South African academic development, and as a white South African, as much as it is a signal of mutually constitutive responsibilities for transformative agency, which I believe we have as educators. And so I'll be echoing prior protests and raising past and present visions, which I hope will inspire deliberations for you today. So thanks so much to the organizers for this invitation, to Gerard, to Fatima, to Najma in particular. I do want to admit that I'm a little bit gutted that today is fully online, not to be there meeting with you and enjoying the vibe, but also particularly because the rest of this conference, well, yesterday and tomorrow, is happening in the Solomon Mahlangu building. It's of course important that discussions such as these happen symbolically in places such as the Senate, which are the central spaces of power and of gathering in a university, but also the building that's the site at Wits, which was the center of protests, where through its occupation, as Andile Ntombeni wrote, Solomon Mahlangu House became the bedroom of the masses. Not only was it the bedroom at night where students slept, it also turned into the study rooms, the classrooms, the kitchens, dining and boardrooms where decisions and big meetings were held. In holding this event here, there are layers of commemoration. Solomon Mahlangu's resistance to the apartheid order, the judicial criminality of his execution by the state, the Tanzanian education facility named for similar reasons of commemoration, which was built for exiled and displaced South Africans, and the success of such renaming of a space within an historically white institution in South Africa as a site of reclamation by the student leaders of the Fallist movements. In this simple gesture of where the conference is held is an explicit interrelation between historical consciousness, ontological remembrance, and reclamation of place for the continued purposes of raising contestation to spatial, intellectual, and economic injustice, and for the making of intellectual homes. So I'm going to begin this talk by discussing commemoration before moving on to the two other parts you can see here. I'm beginning it this way to explicitly link the talk with the call for this conference, which described a decade-long conversation about transformation, equity, and the future of higher education at Wits, where the fallist movements are claimed to have reshaped the institutional landscape. The 2015-2016 Fees Must Fall, Outsourcing, Roads Must Fall, End Rape Culture, Chapter 212, Naked Protests, Open Stellenbosch, and many, many others, distinctly and as a collective force were a reckoning of discontent from academic citizens led by students. What these protests recognized was the social, cultural, political, and institutional nature rather than individual, of intergenerational socio-economic disadvantage, of gender-based violence, and of the related structures and systems of oppression from colonialism through apartheid to the present iterations of neoliberalism, in which we, academics and universities, were and are enmeshed and are actively or passively co-opted into reproducing. Barriers had been created and moreover normalized for students to access particular rights, the right to study for Fees Must Fall, or the right to justice for End Rape Culture. Yet their political participation in universities as academic citizens was seized and mobilized, where they critiqued not only representations of power, such as with Roads Must Fall, but of their positioning as influencing universities as future custodians of knowledge on Africa. That period was where the extremes, the tips of the iceberg of the wider malaise, tore through the delusions of transformation in the post-apartheid dream. While reflecting on this presentation, I realized how much the period caused ruptures in my own intellectual trajectory. And I'm sure all of us here, hear it a little bit this morning, did too, have these personal, professional, political insights into the time, where we were in which moment, which scenes are etched in the memory and the mind. They are distinct, but they also connect to the stories we hear and the images we see, such as those shared by the panel yesterday. When we speak and connect in spaces like these, the memories become layered, colored, reshaped, and remembered, enlivened through collective relation. This is the third time to play a role in a commemorative event in the past 5 years, of which I'm really proud and humbled to be involved. For connection, I'd like to just briefly discuss 2 others. One of these was in 2022. It was the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, also known as the Bogside Massacre, where in 1972, British soldiers shot 26 unarmed civilians, all Catholic Irish, during a protest in Derry organized by the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, NICRA, to protest against internment without trial. I was asked to chair one of the commemorative events, in part because the promise of a university of and for Derry still hadn't been settled, despite the time passed since their peace agreements. While a few seats, as they are called, for Derry students were agreed to by the dominant political parties, the area continues to have the most economic deprivation in the country, very low participation rates in higher education, and strong divisions socially that continue to break out into political violence. Moreover, the representation of its histories, its knowledges, and the authorities of its people are fraught not only in Northern Ireland, but also in terms of avoidance, even ignorance, in the wider consciousness of the United Kingdom, which is where this part of the first British colony continues to be legislatively positioned. It was a real honor to facilitate the asking of the questions that you can see on the screen, which give you a sense of the investment in the idea of the university. And it was also an honor to witness the insights, the memories, and the hopes. So I've been living in Northern Ireland since 2017, following a desire to connect with such transnational questioning. And I think it was catalyzed in part by the ruptures of the fallist movements and the wider ripples in troubled waters, including the xenophobia in our country and its infiltrations into the university. With similar, though not symmetrical problems here, I've learned much about the relationship between macro to micro conditions for how we are socially schooled and socially sanctioned in post-conflict universities. The other commemoration that I'd like to highlight was my invitation to deliver in 2023 the Sukulatu Rao Memorial Lecture for Jadavpur University's School of Women's Studies. For it, I showed this photograph that I had taken of an art student's work a few years before that when visiting the town of Shantiniketan, which some of you may know. It hosts the institution that was once an experiment in educating people from childhood through to university. But Rao never went to university. She wanted to study art making. She never went to this particular university which she desired to go to, despite the relationships that she had with the founder of that university, Rabindranath Tagore. And societal restrictions would have anyway reduced her scope for exploring the outside world or nature. But she continued to practice her art making, and in her life had a considerable impact on the imagination of the readers of her children's books, informed by her insights as a social worker. Questions from Rao's life, her practice and legacy continue to haunt many underrepresented persons whose way of being is representation. As a woman, simultaneously benefiting from and bridled by benevolent patriarchy, her story is a reminder of the privileges and the unprivileged at the intersection of colonialism, patriarchy, caste, and class, and the legacies of these systems of oppression that continue to enmesh academic citizens in India to this day. This reader here, a female, is hunched over a book to the point of being blinded to the world around her, bent over in the task of clutching the manuscript in her hand, seeming almost to harm the body that she inhabits. In art making, this is the genre of the reader, which most dominantly depicts the upper class or bourgeois white woman in Western Europe, affluent, taking time and pleasure in the joy of reading, privileged enough to be literate, but not to read for a profession. In the Western European genre, the woman depicted is often alone in her reverie and thinking. It's a romantic image, and it's observed by a male artist. But the artist student who created this work, whose name is now lost to us, saw something bittersweet in this reader, a female, both young and old, and placed them on the very edge of this plinth, not to elevate them as an isolated classical sculpture may venerate an idea or memorialize a historical figure, but on a structure that is long enough to be a bench for fellow students to sit on in that yard. This is not an isolated figure to emulate, but a fellow scholar hard at work, whose moment of absorption is recognized as something shared, something collectively experienced. By making the sculpture a functional space to sit on, they remind those in that space of their being hailed into a system of learning, of the power of the university, and in the process of us being citizens within the space of reading, learning, submitting, diverting our gaze from life beyond that which is curated, archived, and formalized by the university. Recollection and remembrance can be brought to bear through events or the naming of buildings after people. There can be spaces, even practical ones, like Senate rooms and benches. There can be, as suggested by the call, about living practice and deliberation too, with historical consciousness that takes what each person does beyond the norms of the scholarship of teaching and learning, to think about agency, about responsibility, and the mobilizing of academic freedom for resistance. The nature of the protests of 2015 and 2016 entailed disrupting spaces through various forms of organized, direct protest and body activism, which were then transferred and remediated onto online activism and some definite policy shifts. It has continued over the past decades in scholarly fits and starts and in various practices of academic citizens, all of them, not just researchers and educators, in remembering the purpose of the university by debating about social justice and by trying to enact change within decolonization and transformation. Some have been extremely frustrated and disheartened, claiming we need to decolonize decolonization, particularly as theoretical debates and their ancestry become blurred and messy, and because of some of the leading lauded figures proving themselves all too fallible. Most have healthy skepticism about the institutionalization and mainstreaming of the terms and point to the domestication and the profiteering in it as a fashion. Many of us now also despair about the conditions even being possible. Now with the additional weight of post-COVID wariness, big and mega data capitulation, and the ease of surveillance, and the continuing horrors of genocide and scholasticide in Gaza, and the obvious geopolitical asymmetries as belligerent nations such as the USA wreak havoc on national and international university ecologies. But I contribute to this commemoration with the wide eyes of the need to continue to struggle for and within universities, for them to do work for the global common good, and in the hope that the radical intent for the university is still very much alive, that there is indeed value in the acts and the practices, however imperfect, the acts and the practices of pushing towards decolonization. And so I'm focusing on agency, particularly in this forum, the agency of the educator. I'm doing so, as was mentioned in the intro, drawing from this introduction in a really wonderful book on the good and goods of higher education. But I want to signal right at the beginning that the wrestling really continues, and praxis for me is still such a tension. And so because of that, I continue to ask questions about academics' formation and the relation of our formation to social formation and knowledge formation through the university and its contexts, joining with others such as the Advanced and Critical University Studies Network to ask how can we mobilize our scholarship of the university to do so? And then also such as this book on the right, how does responsibility, ethicality, stewardship continue in academics' lives when the institutional or the national conditions are problematic because of social, political, or violent conflict and their continued legacies? So I wrote the chapter on why decolonization of knowledge matters as a counterpoint or weight. It came from looking at the accounts of a range of university educators who had been participants of projects in South Africa and India, where what was not being said landed up becoming one of those absent presences. And that discomfort in that absent present was without a doubt conscientized by the renewed calls for decolonizing the university, and in the aftermath of my realization of my own gaps within the 2015 4-list frames. What we had done was we had asked academics in a number of institutions in those contexts, academics and contexts which also recognize the need for social justice. We asked them where the locus of their agency was as academics. And they identified the environment of the classroom. So that's pedagogies, methods, and in some cases, relationships, but at the micro-curriculum level. What became clear, though, was that the decolonization of knowledge was not only not taking center stage, it wasn't appearing in the field of possibilities. So from very different institutions, contexts, and histories, the way they got to this end would have differed. And there certainly is amazingly rich research attempting to comprehend the cultivation of academics' disconsciousness. But today I wanted to begin with that end, which is where the tackling of the decolonization of knowledge is believed by the educator to be beyond their grasp, and in some cases, their or our sense of the ethical responsibility as academic citizens when that has become fragile, under some conditions dulled, in others anesthetized. The majority of the participants who interviewed seemed to take the relinquishing of their responsibility for granted. They entrusted knowledge passively to other researchers, to learned societies, and to publishers who were validated by established traditions of the global institution of the university. of concern is that such resignation about their agency within their own practice cut across both those who were critical and those uncritical of global inequalities in universities and in knowledge production. This is a paradox for praxis. On the one hand, most of the educators interviewed were challenging of ivory tower constructions of the classroom, whether campus or virtual, and of the white cube where the outside world is othered. Some of those enacted their commitment to conscientize their students about aspects of the political, historical, ethical, economical, cultural, social relations, and injustice of their societies and global dynamics. They would often facilitate their students' actions for change, for instance, but that was when that was happening outside of the university. On the other hand, for various reasons, they admitted using their academic agency to affect the ecology of higher education. In such ways, they reproduced the dulling of active academic citizenry. You might find in WITS as an institution or your department or your discipline or just you, such concerns about the locus of agency are different to the vision of practice that I've just sketched. I really, really hope that's the case. But I thought it was important to give you a sense of this problematic within the wider milieu of asking about how and where the struggle is happening to decolonize the university. In the chapter, I discuss firstly why knowledge, and that's knowledge singular, matters within the modern Western-oriented university. I won't in this talk engage about why reckoning with the dominant impositions of legitimation on knowledge is important. I think that terrain's been so well covered over the last 10 years. Rather, I'll focus on why knowledge's plural matter, with consideration of their relation to the formations of the self, to the political, social, and ecological. And then I'll look at what potential acts of decolonizing knowledge through education holds for engendering critical and generative roles which educators should occupy. So in what ways might the decolonization of knowledge matter to teaching and learning? Well, several points have been raised by fellow scholars, and I'm going to discuss them really as openings for your deliberations as educators. The first is that the decolonization of knowledge is central to the conditions for academic freedom. So while the decolonization of the curriculum or the university shouldn't be seen as a metaphor which displaces the reckoning for material restitution of and rights to land, self-determination, sovereignty, as Tuck and Yang implore, intellectuals on our continent have recognized that the struggle for epistemic freedom and academic freedom is a continuation of the long struggle for freedom. A fundamental ethical impetus underpins these contestations, and that impetus is towards alterity, plurality, and democracy as a means to push against the dominant violence of marginalization, negation, exclusion, and enslavement. And this is because the concern with decolonization is not only to do with hegemony, but also its creation of absence when there is presence. Mbembe articulated this when he spoke about how this hegemonic tradition has not only become hegemonic, it also actively represses anything that actually is articulated, thought, and envisioned from outside of these frames. This is the epistemic injustice of the disciplines of the modern university, which Keynote argues renders the collective interpretive resources required for epistemic justice structurally prejudiced. Such a meso-curriculum may problematically reproduce the skewed faculties or dulled consciousness of academics, of collectives, of students. De Souza Santos offers metaphors to evoke that which characterizes colonialist social regulation, emancipation, that relationship, and which continues in representations of knowledges. The metaphors that he offers are abyssal lines and gazes of dominant thinking. These lines and gazes map the human or subhuman by invisibilizing entire knowledge systems out of the imaginary of the modern Western university. The implications for the majority world, our knowledges and ways of being and material realities are at the core of this interest. What de Souza Santos suggests is that this ordering system persists in current times and implicates us all. Beyond the period of colonializations, such abyssal thinking colludes perversely in ways where human principles don't get compromised by inhuman practices. One only needs to think of Gaza for that. I'm just going to read it again. Human principles don't get compromised by inhuman practices. Such perversions inform various formations, subjectifications, subjugations, social divisions, and stratifications. They impose subject-object relations of the self to the human other, the individual, and the collective. They shape relations of the human to non-human animals and constructions which distinguish and prioritize the human from nature. They're enacted through local and global stratifications of power, through such mechanisms as the state and soft power, elites, and hegemony. They also impact on the delineation of what are the goods and what is the commons within higher education discourses. But contestations and agential negotiations have been exerted by intellectual workers. Bramba argues that we should account for the connected histories of imperialism across the geographic contexts and projects which have produced such divisions and stratifications in knowledges. But Stein and De Silva assert that where decolonization should differ from many other critiques of the university and modernity is in its emphasis on knowledge's plural and in the insistence of pushing against the continuation of colonial dynamics which are of benefit to the modern Western-oriented university. They write that decolonial critiques refuse the notion that the primary violence of colonization is the exclusion of certain populations and communities from the supposedly universal promises offered by Western modern institutions. To name exclusion as the primary violence of the system is firstly to invalidate other ways of knowing and being by assuming that everyone desires the same promised futures and direction of social change. And then secondly, to invisibilize the fact that these modern institutions don't simply exclude other populations. They are also made possible at the expense of violence against these populations. So as important to the critical project are these projects which are generative of plural knowledges for reclamation, for repair and recognition of what has continued despite, independent of, against, or sometimes alongside dominant knowledge that is canonized and weaponized by the university. So a central purpose underpinning what decolonizing knowledge does is remembering against the problematic construction of subject-object relations within knowledge formation. This is their endeavor to unsettle modernity's dominant ontological and epistemological foundations by seriously engaging the conceptual potential of thinking with alterity, which is an ethical dimension, and from exteriority, which is a geopolitical dimension. Such remembering involves demembering what colonialism did and does. What Ndlovu Gacheni reminds us is not only about memory, but a relocation in history, a de and recentering what is entailed, including recovery and reclamation of authors, in the broad sense of those who generate and represent knowledges, of authorship as an agentially creative and responsible role, and of authority, which is to hold influence, to inform, to produce, to reproduce. In addition to the possibilities within research and the university's wider relations with non-academic citizens and spaces, it's education that offers space to disrupt the reproduction of knowledge singular and to foster such remembering through critical and generative social and knowledge formations. So I'll turn briefly to these possibilities in the last part of this talk. Recognizing that avoidance of decolonizing knowledge may miseducate students and reproduce unjust, hegemonic, and harmful subjectifications of their relations to themselves and to others, human and non-human. What roles might educators play in this endeavor at the level of the microcurriculum? Well, part of the problem is that the machinations of the modern Western-oriented universities come with a set of processes, many of which are assumed. First, that knowledge is produced, that is, created or discovered by the university, and legitimated through various assessment processes that can then be disseminated as knowledge. The educational project at university and at school levels then becomes about reproducing that produced by the university, as if that knowledge is universal and value neutral, where contextualization, translation, and engagement becomes the process and purpose of learning. This construction between academic research and the content being taught within educational institutions is, of course, a top-down imposition of that which is validated by the powers that be within the modern university's machinations. When it's presented as such, it seems to offer us little agency or influence in terms of what occurs at the microcurriculum within the classroom, and often to its relations to the academic and non-academic world, including that which is related to the third mission, that's the university's commitment and engagement with society. Some have framed the role of the teacher as a mediator or guide to the discourse conflicts of what is powerful knowledge. And indeed, I've done this too. In such formations, the teacher as facilitator takes on the role of making explicit the enculturation of the tacit or hidden curriculum around the politics of assessment and of knowledge. In the name of academic success, they produce and reproduce the dominant order as a means of epistemological access for students. In many cases, this is educational development aka industrial psychology. We know the system is skewed, but for individuals to pragmatically cope, the rules of the game are made transparent for the purposes of being complied with, a word that I noticed in the Padlet earlier. Critiques abound, pointing to the dangers of discourses of access for success and of product promotion. Pragmatically, many equity endeavors may adopt such processes to seem affirmative. However, they can't claim to be transformative, as McKenna and colleagues have told us, if they are focused on the microcurriculum without acknowledging the scale of the problematics in the ecology of the university, the institution's relations to its publics, and the politics of the knowledge project. Dominant notions of access for success within the disciplines threaten to ossify the norms and logics of academia and knowledge dissemination as all-powerful. Indeed, even when new areas of inquiry arise, they too are often held back into the knowledge systems of the minority world through resource inequalities, workforce mechanisms, and intellectual framing. Despite these machinations, power dynamics and the dominant discourses of the modern university, counter-narratives about the agency of educators are being increasingly asserted. For instance, research on the hegemony of the global metropole in the domain of knowledge's bacchanal points to how negotiations by academics and institutions can reshape knowledge production. One structured by colonialism and minority-majority world inequalities, the trade routes of the global economy of knowledges can actually be crisscrossed for solidarity, learning, and resistance. In their arguments for the decolonization of universities in Latin America, De Cavallo and Flores posit academic practice as transgression. They hold that the rules and the logics which transdisciplinarity follows are not always already inscribed by those of the modern academic canons. And if you think of what we're doing here within this conference, it too contributes to building the collective nature of the struggle of this gigantic decentering effort as a sort of counter movement, because no single scholar can do it alone as an individual. What many working within this assert is the importance of deliberation and of resistance. Cornell refigures the educator as a knowledge worker who is well placed to engage in several sites of struggle from micro to macro levels. And so within this are the commonplace modes of doing that are central to education, of reading, thinking, critique, writing, and representation. Operative criticism is an umbrella term for various approaches of reflexive criticism, which are concerned with what scholarship and authorship signify by observing and then being responsive to their reception, translation, and impact in context. Epistemic justice is key to disrupting the epistemic injustice within disciplines. With decolonization, such conscientization is a process rather than an ending, but it is of fundamental importance for critical consciousness to develop and to inform action. And it's the educator's role to facilitate operative criticism with communities of learning and of academic practice, in dialogue with students in the microcurriculum and colleagues in the mesocurriculum. Such praxis holds potential to destabilize prevailing mythologies and doxa, and to recognize the contradictions and oppressions enacted through knowledge formation and social formation, where some humans, non-humans, and aspects of the environment are objects of others' will and consumption. In addition to how educators themselves represent knowledges in the curriculum, a directly generative educational role can be played in creating the conditions where students experience the power of counter-narratives of knowledges, where they contribute to their formation and legitimation, and extend the responsibilities and the creativity of authoring and authorship for the common good. Shahajan offers directions for the possibilities of a field of solidarities growing from knowledges produced through educational research on decolonizing curriculum and pedagogy. They based this on a critical analysis of over 200 texts using a geopolitics of knowledge framework. What they found was that the themes that emerged were contextual when it came to meanings of decolonization, contextual when it came to actualizing decolonization, and of course contextual when it came to the challenges that it posed in higher education. But situated within and operating across such contexts, the educators are uniquely placed to enable such a field of solidarities by engaging students, academic and non-academic fellow educators in decolonizing knowledge. It's in contexts where political will and a critical mass exert collective action and urgency where more openings are possible. Some of these contexts, one of them being South Africa, this is happening through the access of first-generation students, in turn, first-generation academics, and also socially marginalized critical scholars. Active conditions are seized for cultivating academic citizens' responsibilities to end miseducation. This praxis is so much more radical than access, than equity, than technocratical critical thinking skills or units of contexts. The intellectual, political, and moral elements of such impetus must not be reduced, simplified, or dehistoricized. The call to decolonize the curriculum was inclusive of the formal, informal, and hidden aspects of the micro, meso, and macro curriculum levels, particularly when linked to decolonizing the university. These wider concerns should not be segregated from the microcurriculum of teaching and learning. Decolonizing endeavors can be too easily compartmentalized, And when that happens, it creates gaps in our academic practices, which allow for the domestication of academic praxis and even the commodification of the decolonialization discourse. Such individual institutional profit is gained to the detriment of decolonization serving the global common good, and of us ever transforming universities into a countervailing force within societies with continued inequalities and legacies of injustice. Academics have power and responsibility as stewards of education and trustees of knowledges. Exercising this with ethical humility may better serve to build the critical consciousness of academic citizens to the injustices of that and those harmed, to recognize and to assert what should be reclaimed from that appropriated, to commemorate that which has resisted or continued despite the modern university, and to work with those, both within and beyond higher education, who can strengthen that made fragile. Linking this commemoration to the different geohistorical moments for decolonization on the African continent, not only their debates conceptually and theoretically about the past and the future, but also their initiatives in the various aspects of academic practice as they negotiate and negotiated change, about which our country is no longer an exception. That continues to be a beautiful prospect from which we as South Africans can only learn. For me, some of this richness has been emerging when studying the everyday, quotidian, and remarkable acts and practices of academic resistance and freedom of socially marginalized critical scholars. For you, individually or collectively, it may be in your practice that I'm so glad that we'll get to hear of today. And so I just wanted to say, if you want a full list of some of the references, because I've drawn from some really amazing scholarship, please look at the open access book chapter, Why Decolonization Matters. Thank you.
Yes, I think you can all join me in thanking Professor Belluigi for a very, very thought-inspiring and quite rich, I would say, provocation, I think, if that's the right word, or call to action of some sorts. And I think at this moment, it's probably a good time if people already had some ideas rolling in the head around thinking with what has been presented to us. And if they have questions or comments that they want to put forward to the professor and in getting us to kind of think collectively around what she has presented. So I will go by show of hands if there are any, and I think there might also be comments on the Padlet that is being managed by someone else. Hopefully we can share some of those thoughts or questions from that space as well. And I guess while people maybe are thinking, one of the questions that I'm struggling with, somebody interested in the whole question of transformation, especially with regards to decolonization and how that should be taken up as a broader call for, as you said, broader academic freedom, especially in a country like South Africa, or I'm thinking in other kind of multicultural countries, where then the question arises around, and this is the usual response, like, isn't then decolonization just another form of hegemony? In that, if we are going to say we're opening up the space for greater academic freedom, greater student education, somebody will say, well, we should also learn about or also invoke problematic discourses that even decolonization is actually trying to undo. And so my question is around, how do we then negotiate that tension between openness and multivocality and multiplicity that we're invoking on the decolonial side, while at the same time getting that language taken up by people who are actually undermining the very premises of what we're trying to do? And I'm not sure if you have an answer to that, but that's one of those questions that I'm really struggling with as somebody who's working with rethinking the rise of the kind of conservative narrative globally, and how that's also a reflection around the limits of the leftist discourse of inclusion. And so how far does inclusion go in this context? And maybe we'll take another question, and then maybe you can deal with those two, and then take another round once you've addressed those. So I think Tanya was first on the list.
Thank you, Prof. Dube. I'm on behalf of the chat moderator, so on behalf of a question in the chat from Caleb, who said, and it's perhaps a little rhetorical, but very important to address, is to what extent do we understand ourselves and our contexts to enable us to see beyond the current conditions. And he says that this, I think, could be one way to enable us to see conditions of possibility, which are the source of innovations. So it's almost a meta-reflexive question. And then there were concomitant comments, but let me just keep that question there. And I believe there's another hand. Thank you, Prof. Dube.
So Prof. Belluigi, do you want to take three, or just the first two, and then we take another round of two?
I think let me do the first few, right? These are also loaded.
Okay. All right. Nazra, you are on next on the list, just so we noted.
Okay, so
thank you, Prof. Oh, sorry. Apologies.
No problem. So Sipiwe, your question about the reception of a leftist, it's not just leftist. I mean, I know you were saying it within, it's trying to do decolonization, but it's trying to talk about then inclusion and plurality. And I mean, I think inclusion and plurality doesn't have to always be decolonial. I mean, I think that's been argued for within many perspectives, and it is a more leftist, soft orientation to what do we do with many different people in our spaces, and how do we try to manage the diversity of the groups in front of us and perspectives. The backlash that you're talking about, so I'm linking the two a little bit to go to maybe to the harder question to answer, or even begin to manage, is that there's a threat that is sometimes felt by those who are being challenged, who were either benefited from systems, and we can talk about economic systems and larger political systems, but also those who benefit from certain traditions within the university, who have their formation within that, and so feel so completely threatened. And those then become, if the very extremes of that, you can see outside of the university in movements of the far right. I don't know, because I've been out of South Africa as an academic, as a practicing academic, what it is really like inside classrooms in South Africa at the moment. But I know from, and I'm going to just be speaking really from research, okay, to answer your question. I know from some of the research that I've done in South African universities, and more of it lately has been in what, and I know it's a disputed term, historically Black universities, and also universities in India with socially marginalized critical scholars. So people who are really pushing now, we're not just talking about inclusion, people who are really pushing difficult issues within society, issues of injustices, and then also are trying to reckon with what you do with the existing canon and what it says and how it constructs people. That the backlash is actually very strong and very hard to deal with. I mean, there were people, and at the time when we first did the research in South Africa, we thought they were exaggerating, where they were talking about threats to self, threats to professional positions, and threats to family, but they weren't. I mean, in some cases, we've seen that has become quite real. In parts of India, there is really growing political oppression. It's always been there to a certain extent, but it's particularly worse now. And I think that places like what's happening in the US, in parts of Europe, in this place I'm living in now with the absolute emboldened far right, it's quite extreme. So we might find in our classroom spaces that these are subtly resisted and people are saying, but aren't you imposing another hegemony? There's a beautiful text by Zeus Leonides, who I think answers this quite beautifully. He speaks about the importance of the need for counter-hegemony, that the soft approach that is only inclusion in context of a long historical legacy where people cannot see the logic of why you're talking about the challenge. It requires a counter-hegemonic response because you literally need to build consciousness in a disconscious society. And disconsciousness is not the absence of consciousness. It's literally a perverted consciousness that can't see the logic in why this is important. So my answer is, drawing from some of my primary research and from some of the stuff that I've read, is it actually does require a confrontation. And Leonides and Singh, I think it was Singh who was actually the first author, say literally own the fact that it's a counter-hegemonic response. It is a force back. Don't do the soft stuff because you're literally needing to dismantle something. I hope that answers your question. Sorry, and I took a long time, but it's a hard one, and I don't know. It's going to be really interesting to see how things happen in different parts of the world. And I would encourage people to be doing research in different parts of the, I know there are many people who are, but to answer questions like this, because, right the way up our continent, people have been grappling with various issues. And there's much to be learned from how people have done this in their practice, right? Not just the conceptual thinking. Caleb was asking about being beyond context and within context and how then that helps to see things differently. I think one of the arguments really for why the ivory tower existed in the first place was that you could create a white cube to separate yourself and see things differently to society, you know? There are many that speak of the play between being situated and having an embodied relationship with what you're learning and then pulling away. I think one of the people that wrote about this within teaching and learning spaces was Donald Shun, who speaks about reflection in action and reflection outside of action, based actually on learning engagement in the design studio. There's so much arguments for both of these things and how they can help us to rethink things. But from what I can see as educators, we are often blinded to certain things because we become enculturated in universities. It has such a strong reproductive ethos that it does require quite a bit to shake us, you know? So I know you were just reflecting, Caleb, but I think, yeah, these questions about where do we get, what do we get from being situated and enriched and immersed, and what do we get from being removed is a really good one. But what do we get in relation with others is, I think, so important too.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think just to kind of at least give space for other questions, I think Nazra was next. I don't see any other hands, so perhaps Nazra, you can go ahead, and then if anybody comes up, I will try to slot them in. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Dina. I mean, you've made such a connection in terms of what will be left for last. But I was wondering, and I know you may have partially, spoken to this, but in our institutions, we often speak the language of decolonization, of social justice, of plural knowledges and dismantling hegemony. Now, these concepts often animate our seminars, our conferences, our mission statements, and even our curricula. But when we are confronted with these ongoing atrocities, like what's happening in the Sudan, in Gaza, or in the Congo, or elsewhere, I find that we are strikingly silent, whether it's in a network or whether it's in this conference. And the silence is not neutral. It reflects a selective politics of visibility, where some struggles are foregrounded while others are sort of in the background. Or maybe it just doesn't emerge in that conversation, and it exposes this profound tension because we claim to disrupt hegemonies, we write about it, but in our omissions, we often reproduce them. And for me, navigating this contradiction has become so difficult because it forces us to ask whether our commitments to justice are principled or merely rhetorical. So, in other words, what does it mean for us as a university and for us as academics to speak of this decolonization, of this epistemic justice and this, dismantling of hegemony, while we are remaining silent, or should I say selectively vocal, on the global struggles of oppression? Now, how do we actually account for this disjuncture between the rhetoric of justice within the academy and the absence of the solidarity, with the real world decolonial struggles? So I think the question I'm asking is, what are the ethical, epistemic, and political consequences of the silence for our scholarship, for our students, and even the very credibility of the university as a site of critical thought? I know it's a lot, but it's been really nagging me, and I thought maybe, I should put it out there. Thank you.
Yeah, Nazira, I mean, that is the way. Hey? And I think I almost don't even want to respond because you've done it, you've raised it so beautifully. There's the rhetoric, there's our practices, those two things, right? And then there is the scale of what we're seeing around us and the weight of omission. So one of the ideals of academic freedom is we are both responsible as individuals, me, Dina Belluigi, you, Nazira Hussain, to speak, and we have that as a professional freedom, particularly if we're researching one of those topics. But then we're also meant to be part of a community and a university. And I think what is still quite strong in South Africa is a strong sense of belief in your university as it's an enactor of its critical function in society and the world. What happens then when there's the silence or the selective choices? How do we live with that? What do we do with that? What do we do even for people who are speaking aloud? And there's so many people who are, and you can see that there's a powerlessness in that as well, but there's at least something. I think a lot of these questions are things that animate a lot of us because we're trying to make sense with how we use our agency in a way that has meaning, how we witness the atrocities around us, and particularly on the continent, I think, because when you mentioned Sudan, it's the forgotten war. That's what it's being called now. Congo doesn't even get mentioned as a conflict society. It's terrible. It's just assumed that it's its norm. But so when I did that one book on being in shadow and light, that was part of what animated my questions in that call, was a sense of when we are academics and the institutional conditions are gone, so the protections are gone even to say something, when your national frames or when everything is stripped bare, what is it that still remains there for you? Why do you still continue? What within what we do matters enough to continue? That was part of my questioning. I think because there are people who say, and rightly say, not rightly say, but rightly question, why not just burn it down if it's not performing a radical role? Well, then the question is, well, what role do we perform outside of all of these things that we can be angry about, that we can accuse? What role can we still perform? And what is amazing is academics in exile, displaced, taken away. Many will disappear, particularly women academics, those who are socially marginalized in the new space. That all that authority is gone. But what a lot of those authors who wrote that spoke about was that weight to represent knowledge and to educate, that is a very simple and fundamental weight, and that still continues. So I don't know if I've answered your question at all, except to say that I think it's the absolute right questions to be asking of ourselves and of our institution all the time, even if we must also hear the response about an element of powerlessness that is part of our conditions.
Yeah, no, thank you. I know that that's a lot of things to kind of string together, but I think that's also a testament to the kind of provocations that you were able to push us towards as a community, trying to think together around issues of decolonization, especially talking about commemoration in a context where we're still dealing with, to use a kind of common word these days, afterlives, right, of the kind of fallist movement. So I think this is great testament to the fact that we're still in the midst, and whether we're rising from the ashes or we're still trying to bend some parts that were not bent properly down, you know, it's part of this whole process. So thank you. And I think I'm probably called to put the end to this part of the program while the next part continues. And in that note, I would like to again extend a great gratitude and thanks to your presentation. And I look forward to actually reading the chapter myself to kind of engage a little bit more with that question that I raised with you, because I think there are some interesting things there to kind of talk about. So I think I will give back to Tanya to take over and direct us on what is to come next. But thank you once again, Professor Belluigi.